So, game this time was Ragnarok. This came out in an Aries magazine. I don't have the magazine with me. I have it in my mom's basement, actually. My poor copy has fallen apart. I've actually played this quite a good deal throughout my life. Not because I think it's a terribly good game, but in particular, it's fairly short. You can play it in a couple of hours. And the rules, although obnoxious in of themselves, aren't that difficult to explain once you kind of have a feel for them. Actually, reading them is painful. I find this one of the less pleasing of the SPI rule sets. It's a style they took for a while with these bold print that you think, it was intended more for first-time learning of a wargame type style of game. Unfortunately, this one has a few weird little ideas, which makes it a little harder to understand if you're, coming in from, say, Napoleon at Waterloo. It is a little bit more complex than that. And, hey, you can tell there's 3 numbers on each counter instead of 2. But yeah, with the different types of units, there being, the Valkyrie, who can kind of engage in the same hex as opposed to the normal ground units who engage in adjacent hexes, and a lot of weirdness where there aren't really there's semi-locking zones of control in the sense that you have that, you have this, disengagement table. Some things that you have to remember, things that don't get done a lot, like the fetters and the blinding light, which is actually generally a bad move. It might be cool against units, but Heimdall gets knocked out so quick, and then the other Acer who has that last tier, usually gets engaged with a hero before he gets one of the joking heroes before he gets to start mopping up troops. So that's one of the big problems, is all those hero abilities kind of get faded away and become a lot less useful. Although we did see in this one, which may be a magical moment for me in that it was the first time I've seen it in a solo game, the Giants end up winning by using their special ability to blow a hole through the gate. I'm pretty sure I've actually seen the Giants win before, though, in solo. I know I've won with them in opposed play. So, every now and then, Aries were... I don't have all that many, and there weren't all that many. I think there were maybe about a dozen of the max, maybe less than that. Because I came in pretty early. And, yeah, there had to be less than a dozen. And I think my subscription ended right before SPI folded under. I ended up getting one S&T game extra, and I think I ended up gypped out of like 1 from my subscriptions there. I had a couple years there. I was a little iffier on Aries because Aries tended to come out with a really kind of hit or miss feel. The S&Ts I was getting at that point, towards the very end, were pretty much all hits for me. I know some of them, like the Kaiser's Battle and Tito, weren't well received, but I thought they were pretty good games compared to some of the older S&T games. The old, very simple quads and stuff, which were fine, but they just didn't, there's only so many games of that same exact pattern that I can cope with, and that number's about 2. Brightonfield I really like, and I think I kind of like Napoleon's Art of War. There may be another couple. But it was the ones where they were trying to do something more than that that really intrigued me. Although Winter War is very good. I don't know if that came out in a magazine. I have the flat box version. And that's very simple. But with the Aries, I felt like, compared to the S&Ts of the time that I was getting them, they were a much, much weaker entry. You had things like this, which honestly, feels about as exciting as trying to roll up and fight battles using the D&D combat system, in terms of, I gotta roll all these dice again and again and again, and I'm just not getting anywhere. That's one of my objections to Warhammer, by the way. The one time I played it, it felt like maybe I played it more than once, but it felt like all I'm doing is rolling dice again and again and again, and I just try to avoid that, and that's why I don't like the BAR either. Battles of the Age of Reason. Too much die rolling, although that's a much more interesting system than this by far. This one does allow for a little bit of kind of tactical interest. Like I said, I think there's some choices that the Giants can make that might improve their chances of being able to make their way through and maybe get an actual giant unit through. So far, though, I've been pretty unable to do that, I think. It's generally come down to the Acer just have so many more... They have so much more firepower, mainly because of the Valkyrie. Their units aren't as capable of dealing damage in the sense that they don't have a high combat factor as the Giants are. Their foot units have a good defense, though, which makes them almost as good as the Fire Giants. Let's see what else. Anyway, going back to the Aries, some of them were fantastic. And that was kind of my... I'm torn on this. I mean, the first one that I got, that I wanted so badly that I got my subscription for, was Barbarian Kings, and that was awesome. I think that's the first I got. Things like Voyage of the Pandora, Star Trader, these were really cool, but there were a lot of kind of misses too. So, for example, following up on Voyage of the Pandora, they did another solitaire game, Return of the Stainless Steel Rat. Okay, but it just didn't catch me the same way. You know, the paragraph system, the first time looking at it, was very good. Stainless Steel Rat felt like a step down from that with its kind of mystery game. It just felt different. It really, it may just be the flavor of the game as opposed to the actual situations. But there was something exciting about exploring new planets and something very unexciting to me about wandering around this spaceship and getting the same results again and again. In both of them, you get the same results a lot. But some of the others were just very, very exciting, but then some of them were not. Arena of Death, Citadel of Blood, and Delta V all felt like bones to me, because each one of these came out in another game. I eventually got Dragon Quest, but I held off in part because of Arena of Death. If Dragon Quest had come out without Arena of Death, I would have bought it. Same probably with Death Maze Citadel of Blood. If I hadn't gotten Citadel of Blood, I might have been excited enough about it to get Death Maze, but there's no way when I had seen what the implementation looked like that I was going to buy a more expanded version of that. Delta V, on the other hand, well, I really wanted Universe, and I just felt boned by having an extra copy of Delta V. Anyway, this one falls in the mid-ground. I don't think it's a great game, but it served a journeyman purpose for me where I can bring it to the table and play a game with someone who maybe wants to do a fantasy game but isn't up for something that's going to take hours and hours like Dark Emperor, isn't really ready for the jump into, say, the historical games that may actually be simpler, things like Breitenfeld or Napoleon's Art of War. They want the fantasy element still, especially because I brought a lot of games to role-playing gamers who were kind of interested in what I did, but they wanted a fantasy game. They really did. And then when I play this or something like it with them and explain to them why it's not as good as most of the historical ones, which has nothing to do with the flavor, with the genre, with anything about it. All it has to do with is both SPI and Avalon Hill did kind of a crappy job on most of their fantasy stuff. SPI did a pretty good job on a lot of their science fiction. I feel like their fantasy was a lot weaker. And Avalon Hill, well, their fantasy stuff felt like it fell flat for the most part. One exception to that may be Dragon Hunt. Well, Magic Realm. But Dragon Hunt, which was a weird kind of game, it wasn't really a war game at all. It had a total, and neither's Magic Realm, but it had a feeling that I felt was very appealing to a newer player, to someone who maybe wasn't ready for Magic Realm as easily. I've played it with, a 7 or 8 year old. Then again, I played Magic Realm with my brother when he was that age too. So I don't know. As long as you're willing to not have to explain every rule, and have a young player understand every situation, or a new player, whatever it is. As long as you're willing to kind of help them through the game, well, you can probably play a very high percentage of the types of games that we have here. But this is a good starting point, even if it's not a great game. It's a decent way to get somebody into the hex and counter type situation without jumping full onto the CRT or whatever, simpler though that may be. Sometimes people don't like to just calculate odds and roll a die on the table. So I've found it very useful for that, even if I don't really like it that much as a game. And that's pretty much what I'd give you. But there's much better stuff around nowadays. Anything recent for a 2-player fantasy game that's fairly simple? I can't think of one. Not offhand. Things like Albion, oh, there's a treasure. Iffy game, but there's one of the ones that I said, oh, this is really cool out of the old Aries, and I didn't mention that one. But yeah, there aren't a lot of 2-player fantasy games that work terribly well that I can think of. And that's really a hole. To me, there's a big hole in the whole fantasy war game flavor, genre, whatever. No one's really done a great job on it. People have done fantasy, not quite war games. Fantasy, definitely not war games. So for the not quite, I'm thinking something like Wizard's Quest, where it's really a wimp game, pure and simple. There's no pretension to a war game. It's more like a Risk or an Axis and Allies in terms of feel. There's things like Magic Realm that are very complex, but aren't dealing with the warfare itself. There's some multiplayer fantasy games, things like Divine Right, or, Elric is sort of in that, I'm not really a war game, but it's beginning to get closer in some ways. Probably the same with Divine Right, actually. But for the most part, it's really this huge hole that's always been there in the hobby. What could draw people into wargaming the best? Well, so many role-playing gamers were in the hobby in the late 70s. And it just shocks me that nobody ever put out a good fantasy wargame. Divine Right is probably as close as you get. Wow. Maybe the Glorantha stuff, but again, that's such a niche market there. Things like Battle of Five Armies. Yeah, they're there, but, they're not. They're like this. Nobody did a really great job on any of them. And that's a shame, and it still seems to be happening. People are still putting out science fiction games, like Space Empires 4X, that feel on par with the science fiction games from the late 70s and 80s. And if anything, the fantasy's dropped even further off the radar than it used to. I'd like to see some very good, serious fantasy treatments. Someone was mentioning over on Consim World, I think it was, that they'd love to see the great battles of history done as a great battles of fantasy with, a real fantasy situation. And I would love it too, with one proviso. The one thing I don't want it to do is feel like Warhammer. I want whatever fantasy I'm doing, I don't care how detailed or undetailed it is, I want it to feel like it doesn't tax my suspension of disbelief too much. And Warhammer definitely does that. The looks of those weird weapons that, like, wow, if you had that and used it, you wouldn't be able to fight. I want my fantasy, like my science fiction and like my history, to be believable. And, you know, maybe my levels of believability are different on fantasy, but I do not want to play a game that, you know, seems silly to me. And Warhammer has always seemed silly, no matter how detailed it got. I can think of one fantasy game that's kind of in almost a war game here. Sorcerer. There's an SPI game. Very, very weird game. The map is something completely out there, but it feels like a fantasy war game in a sense that I don't think I've seen anything else really match in the same sort of way. Anyway, I'll let you go now, and I have a ton of things queued up. I mean, by the time you see this, maybe that queue will be gone, but I've got the whole Age of Renaissance stuff, some more SPQR, Palatinus, all kinds of stuff before this comes up, and who knows when I'm ever going to get caught up, because working from home really puts a cut into my uploading capacity, especially when YouTube bones my uploads overnight at times.